everybody, and thank you so much for sticking in here with us for the last session of the day, um, and of course for waiting for the most sexy topic in publishing, copyrights. Um, I have to make a little disclaimer here, and that is outside is a very bad storm brewing. And if I suddenly start waving my arms like this, it's because a tree has fallen onto the roof and shattered the glass. And as you know, I can't say anything because that sound is copyrighted to Warner Music. Um, so bear with me. I will make that as pleasant as I possibly can. Just a quick reminder for those who haven't been joining us yesterday of who we are. We were established 7 years ago when, after 25 years, I have decided to leave Future, where I was in charge of the licensing and syndication department, and decided to take this, these revenue streams to smaller publishers who wouldn't be in a position to run an international department of that size, because it's very, very, very expensive. We also offer specialized media translations, but we only do print and online and anything related to media. So if people come to us and want, something translated, let's say the instructions how to build a car, we won't do that. So we're just media people. We have an extensive publishing network with over 2,000 contacts, and in our world, that's a lot because we are a small industry globally. We have a lot of skills setting up media businesses in the EU. So often people come to us and they would like to have a little satellite hub over in one of the larger countries in Europe, and we can do that because we have all the partnerships set up in place to help them do that. We're multilingual. I think between us we probably speak about 10 languages, and our reach goes pretty much about onto every continent. I would say, with the exception of Africa, because there's not much going on in publishing terms. But other than that, we're pretty much everywhere. And this, what we can offer is we do licensing and syndication. That's one strong pillar of our enterprise. We have 3 pillars. One is creating publishing content. So we create bookazines for other people or magazines. We do contract publishing, and then the third pillar, of course, is the translation part of the business. And overriding all that is the solid, understanding of media, of legal matters, because that's the heart of the publishing world. So you might ask the question, copyrights, why do you need it? Especially if you're maybe a smaller publisher, then, that's not always at the top of your agenda. But, it allows you to value the assets of your publishing business. And the key question here is, of course, who owns your content? And that's not always that simple to answer. And it might not even be on your agenda right now, but, believe me, further down the line, it will be. You just listen to Leon's presentation, and he illustrated quite thoroughly how their business has changed, and that had implications on their copyright. And if they hadn't had that in place, then none of that, what they have done, would have been possible. So it does increase also the value of selling your assets, because you might come to the point where a magazine or a media object that you publish doesn't fit your strategy anymore, or doesn't perform in the way that you wanted to, or simply it's outgrown your strategy. For example, the publisher that I used to work for bought a DJ magazine, and then realized the magazine was very successful, but the whole scene surrounding that kind of business wasn't a business they wanted to be associated with, because it's sort of associated with sex and drugs and rock and roll, and that wasn't the image that we wanted to show to our clients and readers and the business partners. So keep those things in mind. It also prevents nasty surprises for the same reason. So if you look at again, who owns your content, and let's say you are in the business of craft, then a big question is, You have written the content, fine, but you bought an image from a stock library somewhere, or from Getty, and you have got the okay to use that image. Now, there are two things to consider, because on the one hand side, you need the okay for for the image from wherever you source that image from, but then you also need to get in touch with a modeling agency and get the right for that model. So you see, it's quite complicated, and that's why this is important to to have that on your agenda. And it also boosts the value and scale of your licensing activities, because let's face it, if you want to sell a license or a syndicated article of some kind without the picture, the article is not worth as much, and without a magazine without a cover is not worth it as much, and a magazine without many pictures in it is even less worth. So, rights have there is a reason why they're there and why they need to be considered. So there are a few things that need to be kept in mind when when we're talking about copyrights. So it is really advisable to make rights management a priority from the start, and that is because later on it becomes very time consuming and very costly to do that retrospectively. Again, a publisher that I know decided they wanted to create a picture library, and because they had accumulated quite a lot of assets in the car and music sector, and so they went to tag all the images, the entire catalog that they had sort of accumulated over decades. They had to hire a lot of students, and then there were discussions going on with various picture libraries, and of course their requirements were all different, and in the end it cost a ton of money. I have spoken to other publishers, and they found the very same thing, and many publishers at that point say it's really too difficult. So do this from the moment where you start, and bear in mind that publishing undergoes changes, and it is worthwhile keeping that in mind, and having copyright at the top of your agenda. And if you want to consider what's what are your plans, and what rights do you need for that? So is your plan to sell your business? Then you will have a certain, then you will need all rights, because that will give you the best possible price. Do you want to sell licenses? Then you need to have your major assets rights cleared. Do you want to sell syndication? That's different again, because if you sell a license, it is easier to then say, okay, I want to have the license, the rights for this license, but then for so and so many countries. But syndication is different, because it's not going under the same brand. So different rights apply, and all that needs to be thought through. So my advice is, perhaps if you want to go down that route, you can hire students and make that fairly cost effective, and get them to to tag all that stuff. So it's really important, and for that reason, it is important to create a long-term strategy for licensing your content, not just out for licensing, but also for licensing things in, because you might be in a position where you buy licenses from other people, and you would not believe the amount of people that buy a license in good faith and then realize as a shock that the content isn't available to them, or the content that's of use to them. Not everything in a licensing magazine might be of use to your country. So by not covering for that in the beginning, can land you in big trouble later, because you will then have to clear those things yourself, or worse, you have to come up with that content. So the cost can suddenly rise completely out of your control. You don't really want that. And then you have to make sure that you follow up everything with signed contracts rather than with emails, because they're just not enough. And that is because if you talk to third parties where you buy this stuff from, they don't usually understand the subject matter, and that can backfire. Again, look at music rights. There's a publisher that bought one of the leading rock titles, and when they did that, they of course did that with a reason to also sell licenses. But upon receiving the title, it then showed that that very magazine only had rights available in a handful of countries, because the other countries were already sold in a gentleman type of agreement that nobody could figure out where that was written down. And so the magazine was, really not all that valuable to them. So these things, they are important. There are a few other things that you need to consider, and that is clearing of third-party content. And that's always a little bit tricky, because many times third-party content is done by creative people, and creative people, as we all know, they're very good at their job, but their focus doesn't tend to be on administration. So it is possible that you buy content from them, but then they kind of lag behind giving you the rights, and then you might have sold a licensing agreement for that particular media object, and you can't release that content because the third party hasn't given you the go ahead, the thumbs up for the content. So that's a problem, and I have seen this many times, and the solution for that would be, in what we have done in the end is we just stopped paying people until they signed the contract over to us, and that made it somewhat faster, not super fast, but it did make it faster, because in the end of the day, people need money. You also need to know the limitations of the rights licensed in. So if the rights might have not been cleared. So you want to make provisions in the contract that ensures that you aren't liable if anything happens. And always ensure that you have good communication between your commissioning staff and your rights team. Yeah, so it's not in the nature of things for editors. Usually they are the people on their staff that buy content, to talk to a rights team that really isn't that much involved on the publishing side of things. So they by nature don't necessarily want to talk to each other. So you kind of need to make that happen and force them to have regular meetings. And always carry out due diligence of rights on acquisition. So if you go ahead and you buy a magazine from another publisher or whole portfolio, ensure that you have that covered, because you might otherwise get into the position where you realize later on that you don't really have an awful lot that you can use, and you might overpay. And this is not, this might be hampering your expansion, which is not what you want. And a very, very important part is to educate your editorial team. Yeah, so consider rights purchasing from a central hub. What tends to happen in publishing houses is that you have a couple of editorial teams, and they are, a well-oiled machine, and they do what they do for their magazine because they are they're tasked to do a good magazine, and they have their own little connections, and that all works swimmingly well. But as you grow, this becomes a problem, because then you have individual little hubs who are all buying, their individual rights. And again, in the world where everything is becoming more and more difficult, and margins are getting squeezed, you're not getting the best deals. So you need to create economies of scale and have one or two people doing nothing else but purchasing rights for you, and those people will hold the commercial relationships with your agencies and the third parties you're buying from, and they can also make sure that they have much better negotiation skills, because that's all they do. And that's important. So editors prioritize rights clearance over content production, and that's that's something that isn't necessarily really natural to them, because they will always make sure that they use the most money that they that they have in their budget to create first class content, because that's what they're measured on. And what does that mean? That means they do, I'm not saying that they don't understand the value of copyright, they do, but they might not understand the ramifications further down the line. So, it could happen that they would go to an agency and buy the rights for 3 months. But that's not going to help you, because if you are going to license this content, then you are in a position where you're already running 1 month behind with licensees. So it takes about a month for them to create that content from your license. And then they need another month to print it and to get it out into the public. So by the time it lands in on the newsstand, the rights are gone. And that, puts you and them in a pretty bad place. And also remember that you might want to do licensing deals, especially when you're from Canada in the English-speaking part, with Australia. But Australia sits on the other side, and they are in different seasons, not time zones. Magazine, then by nature, your Christmas issues will be full of winter food, but their Christmas happens to be in the middle of the summer. So, you need to make sure that you have rights covered for all of that and have them long enough. And often people don't think about this. And therefore, continuous education is really a must. So involve the publishers, put that on their agenda, measure them by it. The people, also remember, people leave. And when they do, then often things aren't really documented. And then it's really hard to figure out what happened. So, make sure that your team knows what they are buying rights for and when, and ensure that that can be monitored and measured. So, and also have a strategy in place for freelancers, because they're the weakest link in all of this, because they operate by their own set of rules, and really once they gave you the bookazine that you have asked for, or the issue, whatever it is that you task them to do, in that moment when that's done, you will have a difficulty pinning this down if there's a question or a problem. And then, this also comes to the point of rights classifications, because that's a very complex area. So what are you buying the rights for? Is it print? Or is it online? So if it's online, then it's more tricky, because you might think that a lot of stuff is already in the public domain, and therefore the rights clearance can be a little bit blurry. Then, the question is, are you buying it for one time or for multiple times? Are you using that content maybe again in another issue if you want to use archived content? Is your content time restricted? Is there an embargo? If so, for how long? And again, this comes back to the example of Australia. Is this do you need to have this in place for a year maybe? Is it for one country, or is it for many countries? And then, is it licensing or syndication? So if let's say you have a magazine that's supposed to become a world-leading brand, like, let's say, Elle, which you pretty much find in every country. Do you buy the rights for every country straight away, which might cost you a ton of money? Or do you do this little by little as you go along and collect those licenses? That's possible, but then you might have to consider rights clearance going backward, because some of those publishers tend to have the tendency to wanting to use back issue content for their first issue. So these things need also to be considered. And with regards to licensing or syndication, if it's syndication is a different brand, so other costs apply. And again, this is where the hub comes in, because they know all these things, and they can make sure that you can get the best possible deal on everything that you're doing. So, really buy strategically and have a long-term review for things that you don't maybe even consider right now, but that could become an issue in a world where 360-degree publishing becomes more and more important. So, This has gone back, so let me just go forward again. Yeah. So we're coming to the picture agencies, which is, a vast part of your daily activities. I would imagine. Important here is, again, know your stuff, know what you're buying, and also understand that they tend to be, this amicable force of nature in the world of publishing, and they have monitoring devices and all kinds of things that make your life very, very difficult. Um, However, it's we need to bear in mind that the publishing industry has declined quite a lot in the last decade, and what that means is that they have declined also, because where there's less demand for pictures, there's less business for them as well. So I have um, numerous examples from publishers who have done incredible deals with picture agencies, just because they understand that they can ask for better deals, and are not afraid to do that. For example, some certain pictures will always be difficult to obtain. There's this footballer, you might know, Ronaldo, and Ronaldo has his own, his own copyright team, and he doesn't really work with the major agencies. He doesn't negotiate at all. So, and that if he's really that needed for your magazine to be put on the cover, then you have to bite the bullet and buy that picture. But in most other cases, you have negotiation value, and that's important to understand. And that's so important for licensing, because what that means is that the licensing fee that you get will be that much more valuable for you. So also remember that values go up and down. So be smart and buy at the right time. We already know that the Queen is celebrating her jubilee in summer this year. So if you're not a newspaper and you don't have categories, archived categories of pictures of her, then you would go ahead and buy that at a time when the price is much lower, when there's not that high demand for it. And sometimes this can't be avoided, because if somebody suddenly drops dead and we didn't know that and couldn't anticipate that, then that's hard, because at that point the value goes up. But on the whole, we can plan these things and have an events calendar, for example. So negotiate with these people and do it upfront, and give the give show them that you're on top of your things. Because if you buy rights per licensed country, and then build the cost into your licensing revenue, that's certainly better than having to be confronted with the big lump of cost at the moment go, because that could be very, very expensive. So that's a short overview, and just to let you know how we can help with those things. Once in a while we run courses for editorial and rights clearing teams, so we can help with that, because we have a team of solicitors and lawyers who pretty much have spent the last 20-30 years doing nothing else but copyright for media companies. We can build a strategy with you. You can even outsource your rights clearance, and we can find the right expertise for you in a case of conflict, which does happen. I remember that we had in one of the wholesalers, we had to recall a magazine because there was that was at the time when Michael Jackson was accused of pedophilia, and somebody wrote an article, and we couldn't send it out because there was an embargo, but somehow some copies made it into the trade, and then it just blew out of proportion and could have been very, very costly. But luckily we could limit the damage, and other than getting these copies out from the trade and then putting them back in 2 weeks later, nothing more happened. That's when when you know that you're on top of your rights. So we can help you with all of those things. And just for memory, these are our contact details. So this is the end of the presentation. So if you have any question, please fire away.
what are some typical mistakes that publishers make? Something that you see that they could either fix pretty easily or to know going in.
Well, there's kind of four different classifications of rights that you can buy in the international world, for example. So they typically tend to buy rights for the domestic market. And for whatever reason, that magazine suddenly has international appeal, or the publisher decides to go into international. And let's say, they look at the rights, but because the classifications, one of them is fair use or fair trade. But what does that mean? And that means that you can license that out, but there could be a problem. And if there is a problem, you are liable. And those are the things where you really need to have a firm handle on looking at your content, what it is, where you say fair dealing, and anticipate how that can backfire on you.
So, Regina, when I started working with you 5 years ago, you told me that the number one question that needs to be asked of any publisher who wants to license content and take it to another country was to ask them, do you have full rights for everything in your publication, specifically including the images? Because editors or publishers or whatever, they'll put together a nice magazine or a bookazine, and it'll look really great. And they got the images they needed for their local market at a low cost, and they just think that they have that. But then when you say, well, gosh, I've come up with this great magazine about the sustainability of Canadian, British Columbian forests, and I'd like to license this to Europe to publishers who are focusing on natural sustainability of the world's forests. And oh, by the way, I don't own the rights to the pictures. So then you can't really quote a price, correct? You can't quote a price. You can't sell that bookazine or that magazine to Norway unless you have those rights secured.
Well, you can sell the text only, but that's not so valuable on the whole, depending on the text, of course. If you have an article with Bill Gates himself and it's the one and only, maybe, you can still expect a good price for that. But on the whole, the image is the text is not that valuable without the image. So that's the question that needs to be asked. But at the same time, a publisher that is selling rights also needs to have something that I would call an availability list, where you just list to the publisher this and this and this and this you can't use. These images aren't available for you, and that text isn't available for you. And then build that into your contract, that whatever, that whenever they use something that's listed on the availability list that's not available for them, they are liable. So you can make steps in the in your contracts to make sure that you're covered, and that when they use unauthorized material, that you're not liable for that, because that's really important.
So I actually have another question. Regina, have you ever come across a case, especially with smaller magazine publishers, where, say, it's actually an advertiser that's in their magazine using an image that they didn't double check was copyright free, or that they paid international rights for? Has that ever been a problem?
Yes, it does happen from time to time. It does, and when it does happen, it depends, of course, what kind of image it is, because you might be surprised. You might think, oh, nobody in Albania will care about this, but they do, and somehow these things do come to light. And then, of course, you have to go into a whole range of negotiation with your lawyers. And if it's a person that understands that it has been done completely by mistake, then they will agree a solution with you. But if their whole purpose is to somehow create damage for you, then they might go all the way, depending on where these people are. And if you're dealing with people in the US, then you might argue they're more litigious by nature, because that's how their system works. Then maybe a small publisher in, I don't know, Belgium, where they're more lenient towards finding a solution for everybody and avoiding big legal costs. So yeah. And that's, this is where the contracts, I think, are so important.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's the part that I'm wondering about, because sometimes people overlook that side of it. They only look at the editorial and they don't think, oh, are all of the images, whether editorial or advertising, do they all have rights so that we can, if we're taking an actual full issue, we can distribute that. And then, of course, it has a benefit for advertisers, but, a small advertiser may not be interested or realize or whatever.
Are the courses that you run on editorial rights clearance focused exclusively on international, or can they be tailored to local contexts?
They can be tailored to local contexts, but we would probably need to get in touch with a local lawyer, because every law is different. When it comes to copyright, it doesn't tend to be an awful lot different, but there are variances, but that can be overcome. Yes. I think the main point to remember is, whilst this sounds all very, very complicated, once you start doing it, it really isn't. It's just, it becomes second nature fairly quickly. And if you do it from the start, it doesn't have all these massive cost implications. And that's probably the point to take home with.
Okay, I have one last question coming in. Alison asks, you talked about the idea of having a system for tracking copyright. Is there software for this?
Yes, there is. Most of that, I believe, is often publishers, the larger publishers, all have they all have a system, and most of them have done it themselves. And I think even in software packages like Salesforce, there is some kind of provision built into that for that. But I can hear around what publishers use and make recommendations.
That's
it doesn't, it doesn't have to be anything complicated. You can, if you don't have exactly 300 titles in your portfolio, you can even do that with an Excel database.
Okay, we are a music magazine and the musicians send us the pictures to use. Do we need to make sure that the musician has the copyright?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. It's very simple to answer, because if they don't, then, because he might be playing his own music, or he might be playing someone else's music. That's the first thing. And if they send you the music sheets with it, then the music sheets might be owned by somebody else altogether. So yes, that, get the right clearance for that.
That's a good point about the music itself. And Sylvia's pointing out that for the photographs, it's often the photographer who holds the copyright.
Yes.
So it's important to make sure you get copyright for that.
Yeah, I know of a publisher from Russia who has done an agreement with a top photographer, because they're very, very costly, and they sent them to all these events, which is in the photographer's interest, because they don't always get access to that so easily. So they get backstage treatment and all that, and so the publisher has his first pick, and everything they don't choose, the photographer can use to his own to his own needs. And like that, they get the photography really, really cheaply, but of very good quality. So there are ways around all that. You really have to buy from reputable sources, and the most important part is your contracts need to be, they need to protect you.
So Paula has a question. So regarding an image provided by an advertiser, does a publisher's ad agreement protect them?
I would say yes, depending. I mean, I can't, I can't give legal advice here. You need to speak to a lawyer in the end, and I don't know your contract, so that's a little bit difficult to answer. But in theory, if you have a good contract, then yes, because your contract should really protect you. It should have a provision in there that that makes that pushes that liability back to the provider of that image, and then it's down to them.
I guess that's why it's important to think all of these things right at the beginning and negotiate and put everything in a contract and agreement.
Yeah. There are some websites, Unsplash, that do have images that you don't need to copyright, that you don't need to have copyright clearance for. However, it will be best to acknowledge a photographer or creator of the image in your article if any conflicts arise. That's correct, and to be honest, that's also good, good practice, because if somebody else made that image, then they're very right in the world to be at least credited for it. That's just what should be second nature to an editor. And what's your experience in publishers' articles being posted on social media? Well, that's the area where I said, this is a gray area, and it's not 100% clear, because a lot of that is in, strictly speaking, in the public domain, or at least as a user, you perceive it that way. And of course, you see all of that in Facebook, being shared freely. And I guess to some degree they're kind of, close their eyes when they see it. But strictly speaking, it's you can't do that. And we had a legal team that did nothing else but looking at those images, because we had websites or even whole portals that we licensed out to other people, or just the images, or just the videos. Videos are very, very lucrative these days. And so we had to filter that through and make, and come up with ways that tag those images that weren't ours and where we weren't sure whether they can be used, and blank them out, so that content would go to the license company, and the image might not have necessarily come across as well.
Sylvia makes a good point about the government of Canada working on legislation around compensation for the social media use or sharing by Facebook and Google. So there is legislation coming around that as well.
Yeah, that's good. Because I think, even when those things happen, certainly in the Western world, it happens by mistake, and not because somebody really wants to steal copyright of other companies. I think publishers these days know that that they're not allowed to use other people's content, but all that, of course, falls down the bridge when you're talking of, I don't know, countries, I don't know, somewhere in the deep heart of the former Soviet Union. There's a lot of piracy going on, and they couldn't care less whether the content belongs to somebody else. And then these sites will be shut down, but then they pop up somewhere else. So it's a minefield.